Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So glad to see somebody like Mr. Hedges on C-SPAN. I feel strongly that the liberal media and the government work together, and by doing so, they both gain advantage. One instance that gave me this idea was a few months ago, there was an article by Bill Keller in the New York Times Magazine with pictures of Osama bin Laden and Obama on the bottom of that article. And since I assume that the media is corrupt and the government is corrupt, wouldn't it be good to expose this unspoken alliance? Couldn't that help our country? Thanks a lot.
Well, you've put me in the awkward position of defending the New York Times. I don't think it's quite that black and white. I don't think the New York Times is corrupt. I think that the New York Times is certainly an institution that whose sort of unofficial credo, and I say as someone who worked within the institution for a long time, is do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for money and access. That doesn't mean that they won't alienate them at times. I think the sin of the traditional media, like the New York Times, is more the lie of omission. Now, certainly they served as propagandists, rather naive and unwitting propagandists for the Bush White House in the lead up to the Iraq War, repeating all sorts of claims and putting things on the front page that we now know are untrue with very little vetting or, I think, journalistic integrity. And yet, I think that there are many people within the newspaper who care about news, who care about journalism, who care about truth, and the best reporters care finally about truth. And we talked earlier about objectivity and impartiality. When one feels for the suffering of those in Sarajevo, and I was in Sarajevo during the war, that doesn't give them an out in terms of speaking the truth and writing the truth, even about systems they may, or people they may empathize with. I covered, after the first Gulf War, I was in northern Iraq in the Kurdish-held territories, and I wrote very harsh articles about disputes, even armed disputes between Kurdish factions, corruption, cigarette smuggling, to the point where some of this stuff was even read by the propaganda broadcasts directed at the Kurdish territories out of Baghdad. And yet, you know, as Orwell said, if you look at journalism as a product that we as journalists have to sell, what it is our credibility, that a lie may work in the short term, and a lie of omission is still a lie. But in the long term, it destroys you. So it's not incompatible to feel and also to speak the truth. And I think that the problem with the New York Times is not so much what it covers, but what it often doesn't cover. The fact, as I mentioned earlier, that in the build-up to the subprime mortgage crisis, they weren't out there in poor neighborhoods, that they gravitate towards the centers of power and leave the struggles and the suffering and the injustices that are visited, especially on the weak and the vulnerable, unheard. I think that the media has done a horrific job in terms of highlighting what tens of millions of Americans are enduring. I mean, the 47 million Americans who live in poverty now spend about 35% of their income just on food to eat. And yet they're largely invisible, especially on the commercial media. Now, we are seeing the rise of a non-reality based media. That's Fox News, cable news channels that are not rooted in verifiable fact. And this frightens me very much. Whatever the limitations of the New York Times, and they have them, and I've been very critical of them, including my book, Death of the Liberal Class, they are rooted in verifiable fact. That discussions are based around verifiable fact. And with the rise of so-called media outlets that discard fact, where opinion becomes interchangeable with fact, then you enter a kind of totalitarian state, because people are allowed to believe whatever they want to believe or whatever they are made to believe. And I see the kinds of attacks that are made by the right wing against the New York Times as not so much ideological. I don't think the New York Times at this point can be classified as a liberal newspaper. But I think it's much more pernicious, that what they're attacking is reality-based media and essentially trying to destroy it. before they drop that sort of iron curtain of propaganda around all of us.